Okay, guys, so welcome back. This is the weirdest thing I've ever lived through. I'm sure um, you never expected this would happen in your lifetime, crazy coronavirus. But anyway, let's make the best of it. I'm going to introduce you to sections 2 and 3 of chapter 13. We're, just to remind you, talking about the Middle Ages and the rise of feudalism and the age of chivalry. So I'm going to introduce you to the puppies just to give you a little bit of comic relief, and then well get on with the lesson. All right, guys, so this is Chloe. Chloe just turned a year old the other day. Hey, say hi, Chloe. And then here's Peanut. Actually, his name is Corky. And, well, he does not want to be held, but this is Corky. Okay, so I know it's been a little while, but hopefully you guys did some reading when we last looked at the textbook. And you remember reading about how Europe was invaded between 800 and 1000 AD by the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims. So that was three major groups. And yes, it looks like the word Magyar, but it's actually pronounced Magyar. It's Hungarian. So the first group, the Vikings, basically pillaged the monasteries and the villages where they went, and they later ended up converting to Christianity, and they stopped raiding and settled down and kind of became farmers and traders and Christians. The second group, the Magyars, were actually Western Asians who settled in Eastern Europe in the country of Hungary, and they attacked from the east. And then you had the Muslims who then invaded Spain and Italy at this time. You probably also remember reading about Charlemagne a little bit, and that after he died, he was a great king, right? After he died, there was a great deal of disorder in society. And so the system called feudalism, which was a social system and a monetary system, or a way to organize the economy, developed as a way for people to protect themselves because they were in constant fear of attack. And as you read about and did on the little worksheets, if you remember, there was a breakdown of centralized authority. So after Charlemagne, things kind of broke down. And what happened was, instead of having strong emperors or rulers like strong kings, sometimes you did have kings, but the nobles gained a lot of power. Sorry, Corky is freaking out. And sometimes, in fact, the nobles were stronger than the kings, and there was often a power struggle between them. But you can see sort of this system of, kings who have nobles, and the nobles help provide them with the money they need to do what they need. And the nobles then provide land for the knights, and the knights basically provide smaller plots of land for the peasants to live on, and the peasants provide food and services for the knights, who then provide protection and military service for the nobles, and then the nobles provide money and knights for the king. So it's kind of a, what do they say, a symbiotic relationship. So let's talk a little bit more about these feudal relationships. And the most important thing to understand is that the lords granted something called fiefs to the vassals. So fiefs were plots of land. And the vassals would then fight for their lords, and they could, if they fought hard and won favor, actually become their own landowners, and over time become powerful lords as well. And vassals could have their own vassals, so it was a little confusing. It was a very diverse group of people. It was more of a relationship than a clear group of people in a certain economic position. And so that's important to remember. They could be rich landowners, all the way down to a low-level knight. And okay, and then you have knights, right, who basically started using cavalry and heavy armor, and the whole system sort of rested on this idea of mutual obligations. If I do this for you, you'll do this for me, and that's kind of how we survive. So servants took, or vassals took, an oath of fealty. Fealty just meant faithfulness or loyalty or payment. And so in your book, there's an excerpt from a Bishop Fulbert at that time who talks about 6 things that a faithful vassal should always keep in mind. And these things are pretty simple. So basically, don't harm your lord, right? That's kind of a given. Keep him safe, be honorable, be helpful, don't cause trouble, be easy, kind of like I hope for you guys in class sometimes, to not cause trouble, but sometimes that's too much to ask for. No, I love you guys, but you know what I'm talking about, especially 7th period. So you're supposed to not cause trouble, and you're also supposed to be practicable or useful. So don't be just somebody who sits around and does nothing. The Knight's Code of Conduct developed in the 12th century. Basically, it was how knights were expected to behave. A knight was supposed to fight for his god, his lord, his earthly lord, and his lady. And he was also supposed to protect the poor and the weak. There was also a significant amount of diversity amongst the peasants. The peasants were generally unskilled workers. They were not educated formally, and they tended to work the land. Some were actually free, but some actually owned small plots of land. So there was a number of differences or distinctions between the peasants. Serfs were not free, on the other hand. They were tied to the land. They had to work, they had to pay rent to their lord, and they had to pay tithes to the church. And the lords had a great deal of control over their lives. Like, for example, if you were a serf and you wanted to marry someone, you had to get your lord's blessing and permission to do that. Over 60% of the population by the 9th century were in this category. So about 60% of the European population were serfs by the 9th century AD. And then finally, we're going to end with a review of some of the definitions we learned in this chapter. Remember, fiefs are basically property, land, including labor, which was a way to make money. So if you got the land, you would also get the serfs that lived on the land to work it. Manors were a unit of a fief in a state run by a lord. Lords tended to be large landowners who could be kings or wealthy nobles. And then vassals were people who got land in exchange for providing protection to their lords. And knights, of course, we all know who the knights are, since we are the knights, right, at St. Joseph's. Soldiers who would fight for their lord and protect him, and supposedly protect society as well, and particularly the poor and the widows and the orphans. So that is sort of the second part in a nutshell, and hopefully that will help you learn the material while we're all stuck at home. I'll see you in the next one.